This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzahon, and it's Friday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. At least, that's usually what I do. Sometimes I also look at the worst cards ever, but today we're not doing either of those things. This is a list that is entirely based on my own experiences, something I do in this series from time to time, like a few months ago when I did a video talking about 10 bad cards I thought were awesome when I was a kid, and this video is sort of a sequel to that. There were lots of bad cards that I thought were good in my early Magic days, and it's fun to talk about them and look back at how I thought about Magic as a new and very young player. Evaluating cards perfectly is impossible, even for the most seasoned players, but 10 and 11-year-old me was particularly bad at it. If you started playing this game when you were quite young, you probably have a list of your own that would contain a lot of cards from the sets that were brand new when you started playing. For me, that primarily means sets released between 1998 and 2000 or so. The major sets at the time were Urza's Block, Masks Block, and Invasion Block, and 6th edition. So with this video, I'm going to talk about 10 especially bad cards that I thought were good, explain what I thought was so awesome about them at the time, and then discuss what makes them bad cards. As is usually the case with my bad card top 10s, for a card to be considered for this list, it has to not have any premier event top 8s and also not be widely played in EDH. Alright, let's get to the list. At number 10, I've got Scaled Worm. I think most of us have some huge worm we thought was awesome when we first started playing, and for me, that's Scaled Worm, which was reprinted in 6th edition. As was often the case for me as a kid, the art of a card played a big role in me liking it because I thought this thing was just really cool looking. The flavor text also really sold me on it, but also it just seemed like such a massive, unbeatable creature to young me. I mean, it's a 7/6. What can possibly take that down? Unfortunately, this card wasn't even very good on the vanilla test back in 1999, and it's generally just a bad card because it isn't anything but an inefficient vanilla creature, so I probably shouldn't have been playing 4 of them in a mono-green ramp deck. At number 9, it is SUNWEB, another card that I knew first from its 6th edition reprint. Just like I think it's pretty common for us as new players, especially as kids, to think some big vanilla creature is very good, like with Scaled Worm, I think it's also pretty common for newer players to get really into walls at some point. Back then they had special rules that didn't allow them to attack, Defender wasn't a thing, and so many of them seemed really efficient and the flavor was pretty neat. And yeah, SUNWEB was a card I was really into for a while. After all, it's a 4-mana 5/6 with flying. That seemed incredible to me, even if it couldn't attack. Of course, it also comes with one other really significant downside: it can't block small creatures, and that makes the number of cards this can actually block a lot smaller, and also means it's pretty terrible against actual aggressive decks in general, which is kind of where you want walls with high power in the first place, so yeah, this isn't a very good wall. At number 8, it's Death Charmer. I thought this Grey Ogre seemed really good, since if I attacked with it when my opponent couldn't pay the 2 mana, they would lose 2 life no matter what. At this point in my Magic playing life, I hadn't fully grasped the concept of card advantage, so I thought that losing my Charmer just to do 2 damage to my opponent was well worth it. I tried to make a mercenary deck work in general, and Death Charmer for me was one of the biggest reasons to go that route. And yeah, mercenaries from Masks Block ended up being pretty bad collectively. And with this card, the fact that the opponent can negate the effect also comes up a lot, and playing with this card really helped me understand how valuable an individual card is, and that just doing 2 to the opponent situationally wasn't really worth just giving this card up. At number 7, I have MEGATHERIUM. This was one of the first rares I opened from a MERCADIAN Masks pack, and I thought it seemed amazing. Surely a rare from the new set must be really good, right? I think a lot of us probably think this way when we're about 11 years old, and I mean a 3-mana 4/4 with Trample seems awesome, and the creature in the art was like anything I'd ever seen, and I thought it looked really cool. I mean, I knew the card had a downside, but I thought I could find a way to make sure I could cast it pretty efficiently. Problem is, for you to actually take advantage of how cheap it is, your hand has to be pretty close to empty early, and making that happen early enough in the game for MEGATHERIUM to be a real threat is very hard. And if you go out of your way, like I did, to try to cast MEGATHERIUM cheaply as early as possible, it usually involves making yourself discard cards, which is generally not a great plan in a deck with no other payoffs for doing so. So yeah, you just end up not being able to cast this most of the time, and once you finally can cast it efficiently, it's not the biggest thing on the board. At number 6, I've got Port Inspector. This 2-mana 1/2 lets you look at your opponent's hand if it gets blocked. In my early days of playing Magic, I put way too much value on seeing my opponent's hand. I thought it was just one of the most powerful things you could do, and I thought any card that would let me do that was amazing. It kind of makes sense I valued it so much, as it does sort of feel like you're getting a big leg up when you know what your opponent has in their hand. After all, you get to see something that is normally concealed by the rules of the game, and there is, of course, some value in seeing your opponent's hand because it does let you have a much better idea of what your opponent is planning, and there are some nice cards out there that let you get that information, like Gataxian Probe or discard effects, but I still really overvalued how good it was, to the point that I thought Port Inspector was good, and it definitely isn't. It has inefficient stats, and you only get to see your opponent's hand if they block it. My plan was to buff the Inspector, so my opponent had to block it more, thus giving me all the information, but unsurprisingly, that strategy didn't go very well. At number 5, I've got the Flailing creatures. Notably, the Soldier came in at number 1 on my list of the worst 1-drops ever, so you know I think this is a bad card these days, but that hasn't always been true. I thought Flailing Soldier and the other Flailing cards for Mercadian Masks were really good, so I built an aggro deck featuring 4 of each of them. After all, you get a really efficient creature that you can pump, but of course your opponent can also shrink these creatures. At the time, I really felt like the worst case was that my opponent would have to spend their turn killing these, and if they didn't, I would just get to beat them down. But the downside here is very real. You basically hand your opponent a removal spell that doesn't actually cost them a card with each of these Flailing creatures. For example, if you're on the draw with Flailing Soldier as your 1-drop, your opponent can just pay 2 mana to kill it on their turn. I thought that would be good, but this is another instance where I was really underrating card advantage. My opponent might have to use both their mana on turn 2 to kill it, but them using their turn that way is offset by the fact that they didn't have to use any of their cards to kill it, and they will very quickly pull ahead of you after they do that. So yeah, these are all bad. I think the Soldier is the worst of the bunch, but they're all pretty terrible, and the deck I built around these creatures was also terrible. At number 4, I've got Mercadian Lift. I looked at this card and saw something that could allow me to put big creatures into play, you know, like my Scaled Worm, but the reality here is pretty rough, since you have to pay mana every turn to add winch counters to it, so in the end you don't really get a discount. You're instead paying on an installment plan, and a very, very slow one. You even have to remove all the counters from the lift every time you put a creature into play, so you have to start over. So yeah, once I actually played with it, I realized it was too slow, but I thought it was one of the best cards ever for a while there. It's pretty funny to compare it to Ether Vial, by the way. At number 3, I've got Pretender's Claim. This card is a bit like Death Charmer and Port Inspector from earlier in the list, in that I thought it was good because I knew I would get something from attacking no matter what, thanks to this effect. If they didn't block the creature I put this on, great, I got in for some damage, and if they blocked the creature, I would get to tap all of their lands. The only problem is that tapping down the opposing player's lands on your turn isn't that great, especially because you only do it once combat happens. Your creature already has to be pretty good, or your opponent can just block it and kill it without much of a downside, and if it isn't a problematic enough creature, and they do want their lands untapped, they can just take the hit. So yeah, this pretty much doesn't do anything. At number 2, I've got Crystal Rod and the other cards in that cycle. Basically, I thought all of these color-specific ways to gain life seemed amazing, and I thought I should have them all in my sideboard, because gaining life with them against the right opponent was just way too good not to. I really overvalued life gain in general. After all, it gets you further away from being at 0 life, and when you're at 0 life, that means you lose, so that means you're getting further and further away from losing when you gain life. Unfortunately, that's not usually how it ends up working, because if one spends the mana and the card on an effect like this, you're very rarely going to get back enough to make up for all the resources you sink into it. Obviously, the red versions of these type of effects do get a little better since red decks tend to be aggro or burn, but there's still pretty awful ways to go about sideboarding against them. And at number 1, I've got Healing Salve. This is a card that is famously way worse than the rest of the cards in its cycle, which include Giant Growth, Dark Ritual, Lightning Bolt, and Ancestral Recall. 11-year-old me thought this was pretty darn good though. Once again, we're talking about life gain. How can that be bad? Plus, I love that it was modal. Sometimes preventing 3 damage with it was awesome. Funny thing is that I do still love modal cards today, and I guess I sort of have Healing Salve to thank for that, but Healing Salve is a pretty terrible card. Gaining 3 life for a card isn't worth it, and while the damage prevention effect can have more of an impact on the board, it's still far too narrow to be worth it. So, those are 10 bad cards that I thought were good when I was a kid. What bad cards did you think were good when you were a kid? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future editions of MTG Top 10, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past MTG Top 10s, including some others about how bad I was at Magic when I was a kid, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can do that on Patreon. Thanks for watching.